Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM, the official podcast of Monsters.rent. I'm Justin Lewis.
And I'm Tanner Wayland.
And we are here to help you tell better stories for yourself and your players as you dungeon master sessions of D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. We'd like to give you some quick announcements. We actually have one before the show, and then after the show, if you want to stick around, we have some more announcements then as well. But first, let's talk about this. Tired of being alone? Are you tired of not having any of your players understand you? Are you tired of never truly belonging? Well, you're in luck. All you need to do is join the Guild. The Guild is a unique and exclusive experience that is only open to Dungeon Masters. It is a full community focused on helping ease your DMing burdens. Want to meet other DMs? Join the Guild. Want to discuss your homebrew ideas with people who would appreciate it instead of just telling your cat? Join the Guild. Want to find a place where all your wildest dreams will come true? Join the Guild. Go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free. Wait, that can't be right. Chuck, can you check this again? Is this supposed to be... What? Oh, they're serious? It's free? Oh, okay. All right. Yes, go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free, even though they are crazy for giving this away for free. Common side effects may include burping, sneezing, laughing, breathing, hearing, listening, tasting, farting, critting, sarcasm, and in extreme cases, explosive diarrhea. Awesome. With that out of the way, we can get into today's show.
Hello, and welcome to How to Be a Better DM. My name is Tanner Wayland, and together we're going to learn how to be the best DMs that we can be. And we're going to have a great time with our players, because that's the goal, right? Today we're going to jump right into the topic, borrowing. Now, I'm not talking about, oh, you don't have dice, borrow that from a friend. No, I'm talking about borrowing in terms of like creating your one-shots and your campaigns, and how borrowing can help you as a DM do a lot more than you by yourself could accomplish. So what do I mean? Basically, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that there aren't any new stories out there in terms of like, hey, any story that you and I can come up with, there's probably a story out there that, if not exactly, is fairly close, beat for beat, with the plot that you have in mind. And that's, in some ways that could be discouraging, but my topic today is trying to convince you that it's not. That you can actually help improve your storytelling and even better, save you time and effort by borrowing from the best stories and myths and ideas out there. So why am I kind of harping on like, hey, it's really important? I'm harping on it because, frankly, I have an issue of when I'm going into a session or when I'm planning a one-shot or anything like that, I really want to make it something novel and new and something that the players will be like, oh my goodness, I've never seen that. Now, if I'm being realistic with myself, that's not... that might happen some of the time, but most of the time they're just going to be like, oh, that was a good story. And they're not going to be thinking, oh, I've never experienced a story like that. They might be surprised occasionally, because I think that some DMs fall into kind of a routine of doing similar stories. So sometimes if you switch to a new type of story or campaign or session where the objective's different, it's not just beating an enemy, it's instead escaping a castle or something like that, or a prison, then they might be like, oh, that was kind of a fun change. But they're not going to judge you for, oh, a prison escape? I saw Shawshank Redemption. Kind of a lame idea. No one's going to be like that. They're always going to be like, hey, I like that it was new and novel for them. They're not going to care about how, like, if the idea that spawned the story that you kind of ran them through, they're not going to care where you got that from. And in some ways, they might actually appreciate it. Specifically, think about movies and stories that inspired you and interest you. maybe even from some really good genres like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or some classics like Alice in Wonderland, Count of Monte Cristo, things like that. You can pull so many wonderful set pieces and ideas for plot development from these stories, like Lord of the Rings. I was talking about a prison escape, which, I mean, there is a prison escape in the Count of Monte Cristo, just as a side note, and it's a really amazing part of that book if you haven't read it, where he literally like kind of tunnels out with the help of of a prisoner friend who dies on him, essentially. He tunnels out and then it doesn't work, and then he switches place with the body. That's an amazing, interesting story that, frankly, as a DM, you're worried about getting stat blocks. You're thinking about which characters to put in, right? And then on top of that, you're supposed to think of a really cool, interesting prison escape with a lot of different outcomes. I mean, it's not impossible, but that's kind of a tall order. Now, think about it the other way. If you, let's say that you're like, hey, I want to do kind of a big battle, and you're like, oh, I'm not feeling inspired. Rather than racking your head and eventually just landing on, oh, we'll just do a straight, 5 players versus 10 enemies, and some of them are minions. You could do that, or you could look at the stories that you currently know, and you could borrow. You could kind of snatch set pieces from them. You could borrow Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, and what you could do is be like, okay, I'm going to make a fight that is very reminiscent of Helm's Deep. It's going to even have similar kind of wave mechanics, right? In Helm's Deep, how initially there's a lot of fighting from the top of the wall, and then eventually some big catastrophe. In Lord of the Rings, it's a bomb, like a huge bomb, but in your game, it could be something slightly different. You just could reskin it to some other catastrophe that makes it so that you have to fight, down on the ground with the enemies. And then finally, you get pushed back, and you're just kind of doing a siege, and you have to decide what to do at that point. See, that is such an interesting development for a castle-based fight in a war, right? And you didn't even have to come up with all those different ideas. You just have to take it, reskin it, and this is kind of what I want to talk about as a tip here, you can even reskin it, but still kind of clue your players into the fact that, hey, I took inspiration from Lord of the Rings, you should too. Because I think we all know that our players, when they're going into D&D, they already have some inspirations from media and from stories in mind. And so if you are playing into a certain story, then why not just lean in? If you do that and you're like, hey, players, for this next session, I've got a really great thing planned. It's a castle siege, and then as you prep that kind of thing in your player's mind, they might think of Helm's Deep, or they might think of some other kind of siege. That's what's wonderful. If you just kind of give them the forewarning that, like, hey, this is what you can expect, then they can start thinking about that and getting ideas for what they'd like to do. And then once the actual session comes, you're sitting there and you're running it kind of, as I was saying, according to the plot development of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. Suddenly, the players start seeing some familiarities. Maybe they make some jokes, some comments. Maybe Lord of the Rings even gives them some inspiration to act in a different way than they normally would. And that's kind of where the magic comes from with borrowing ideas, is that it saves you time, gives you excellent plot beats and points, even if you don't follow it 100%, down to the letter. And then it also can help your players act differently than they normally would, because they get to see, like, oh, this is an opportunity to kind of live out a slightly different fantasy than the typical oh, we're an adventuring party, in D&D. It kind of skews it a little towards a different story and makes it a more interesting thing. And so with that in mind, that's kind of my first tip when borrowing is be aware of when you want to let the players know and when you don't. Because if you do, then you can do that prep work to let them know, like, hey, get in this mindset of that kind of story. And it can really save you a lot of time. Now, on the other hand, if you don't want them to know and you're like, hey, I want to kind of take similar ideas, but I don't want them to know where it's going. Like I said, reskin it, make the different monsters than the ones in the story. Not some kind of orc-ish thing, but instead have it be like gnomes, for Pete's sake. That'd be kind of hilarious in its own way, just an army of gnomes. But it could be very interesting. And it casts such a different flavor to the story, even if you change nothing else. Because gnomes have their own kind of past and their history. So that's kind of an interesting idea there. Beyond that, I think that if you're worried about your stories becoming just copycats, that's a totally valid concern, right? I would say that the way to avoid that is tweak wherever you feel you could improve the story or change it in a very exciting way. And second, focus on character stories. If you have memorable NPCs, memorable motivations for your players, and connections, then that story takes on a whole personal meaning for them, and it becomes an entirely different thing, right? Because unlike another hero story, going back to Lord of the Rings, which I've mentioned probably too much at this point, they aren't Aragorn, Legolas, or Gimli, right? And that's kind of the great part for you, is that you can write an entirely different story using a similar setting, similar plot, but then place different characters inside of it and, really play to those characters' motivations. And the entire end result will be fairly different in a positive way. Now, if you're trying to borrow ideas, here's what I'd really suggest. Thinking about motifs, settings, and scenes. So specifically, if you think of a story that you really enjoy, and you're like, okay, here's a story that happens on a boat. Could be a prison boat, could be a normal boat, could be a pleasure trip, right? If any of you have seen the movie Triangle of Sadness, then you'll know that that's kind of like, oh, that's a pleasure yacht gone horribly wrong when it, in multiple ways, as some of the passengers are awful, and as a storm happens, and as the pirates come, you can take scenes like that and settings, and it just gives you so much to play around with, because that movie or that story has already fleshed out some of the things that could happen in that setting, and you just need to kind of have the options available. It means that you can spend more time coming up with the mechanics, which is always time consuming for me, right? You can come up with the mechanics of, oh, what does seasickness feel like and how does it affect the players, rather than having to come up with, oh, what if they could get seasick? Because the story's already there and it's already giving you that idea. Other than that, I said to use scenes as well. And scenes are kind of slightly different from settings in the way that it's like an event. You can borrow a lot from different events out there, right? Like competitions or trials. Justin, Rob, and I, we're actually we're working on a one-shot that has a lot to do with trials, and I can tell you right now, even though we're trying to be fairly unique, each of us have gone into this with certain imagery in mind that has come from kind of, trials from different stories that we've read, or, a monastery kind of monk setting, and that's all informing the story. And so I would think of events that you can really kind of copy, like an event Classic one, crashing on an island. Or you find out that one of your players is actually a long-lost child of a rich family. Guess what? That doesn't maybe sound too exciting just initially. It's like, oh, they found their family? Cool. They meet their family and that's it. And it's heartwarming, theoretically. No. What I'm saying right now is you can make that a lot more interesting. Think about movies where people have had a lost family and they found it. A lot of times those kinds of stories have to deal with, a lot of feeling out of place. Sometimes that lost family is kind of shady or sketch, and sometimes that lost family is actually in trouble themselves. And if you just kind of get that idea from a story, borrow it, and repurpose it to your players' interests, you've got a golden story arc right there. The story arc where John Fletching Arrow found his long lost brother, and then he went back to the family and all the players came as guests, because they're friends of John. And then, oh wow, who would have thought that the family actually made their fortune from enslaving creatures of other races, and now you have to deal with that. And those kinds of stories, like I'm coming up with a lot of stories right now, and yes, it is cheap to come up with stories. I realize that that's not the whole game. But if you're ever feeling like your stories are kind of boring, then borrowing an idea from a story that you know for a fact isn't boring, then that's a great way to start. And then from there you can be a little bit more creative and you'll feel the juices flow a bit better because you will have started at a very exciting place. Or even if you didn't start at an exciting place, or an exciting enough place from your own point of view, you can later on incorporate kind of a story, right? Have the players arrive at a Jurassic Park type location where it's just a land lost from time. Or have them have some of the kinds of events that happen to some of our favorite heroes and protagonists in movies and books that we love. And that would be my invitation to you, is to look for opportunities to spice up your story occasionally with a classic borrowed story arc. And once again, take the time to make it unique to your adventure and to fit your players' motivations and interests. Maybe add a new skin to it. But in the end, really try and follow that award-winning and interest-winning plot arc and event kind of string. And if you do that, I honestly believe that you're going to have a really fun story arc, and it's going to be a very new experience for your players. You don't have to do everything alone as a DM. I know oftentimes it feels like it, but you can get inspiration and help in the end from these stories. So get on out there when you're planning for your next few sessions. Make sure to borrow something that intrigues you and inspires others. And until next time, let's roll initiative.
Thank you for listening to today's show. We really appreciate your support and your patronage. We have a few more announcements to go over. First,
did you ever fall in love with the library as a kid? It was a place where you could experience 1,000 stories without having to buy 1,000 books. That is what Monsters.rent can do for your D&D campaign. You can rent and swap out as many quality miniature monsters and creatures for your D&D party as you could ever want, without having to buy them. You can rescue villagers from a kobold camp, or lead your party through the fighting forest, or many more adventures. We're coming out with new bundles all the time. Just sign up for our subscription to get access to your own personal library of minis. Go to monsters.rent to find out more. That's the website. Monsters, with an S, .rent. Get your library pass to a world of minis today.
We also wanted to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by Stardust and Dragons. I'm going to let one of the cast of Stardust and Dragons, Christian Hatcher, and his crew tell you a little bit more about it.
This August, a new adventure podcast is coming to a platform near you, filled with action,
You one of the two of them. We can't keep taking hits like that.
drama,
Everything that she's been doing, everything she's going to do, finally sets in.
and stardust.
Help! Help! Someone, please!
Find out more about this epic odyssey at stardustanddragons.com, where adventure awaits in the stars.
That's all the announcements we have today. Again, thank you so much for everything you do for us. You make this show possible. Like we said before, we'll be back next week with another great episode, and until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative.